Hi, this is Luke with the Gamer, and I'm going to talk about whether you should choose the male or female protagonist in Persona 3 Portable. Persona 3 Portable is the second re-release of Persona 3, and while it mostly focused on implementing updates and making the game easier to play on the go, added in the hopes of bringing more female fans to the series, Persona 3 Portable released in 2009 and introduced the female protagonist to the Persona world. But with a new character came changes, both big and small. So if you're not sure whether you should pick the male or female protagonist in Persona 3 Portable, we'll help you decide. When the original Persona 3 launched for PlayStation 2 in July of 2006, your only option was to play as the male protagonist. Personality-wise, the male MC is vastly more stoic than his female counterpart. He has far more opportunities to express apathy in conversation, and often only speaks when spoken to. There are a handful of characters who react lukewarmly to him, but are much friendlier towards the female protagonist. But as the prototype game for what Persona would go on to become, there are things about the male protagonist that newer players may not be familiar with. In the male protagonist story, you don't form social links with any of your male squad mates. You get to know the male members of your squad through the story of the game, but you don't have the option to hang out with them outside of the story. Instead, you'll have an assortment of classmates from around your high school to fill the social links. And when it comes to social links with female characters, while later games give you the choice between a platonic and romantic relationship, Persona 3 Portable doesn't. If you play as the male protagonist, you'll end up dating every single female social link you max out without the option to decline. When it comes to combat, in the original Persona 3 the male protagonist was able to use a litany of weapons. However, in Persona 3 Portable, he's down to just one, his one-handed swords. And though both protagonists have Orpheus as their initial persona, the male MC's is slightly different to the female MC's. Visually, the male protagonist has a silver-themed Orpheus and its weapon has a more masculine appearance. And when you arrive in the Velvet Room, the male protagonist does not have the choice for which of the Velvet Room attendants he'd like. The male protagonist will always have Elizabeth. In his school life, the game will feature the original theme and soundtrack for the game, and there are a lot of things about the game that fans of the series will love. The UI in your bedroom at your dorm will be themed in blue. And when it comes to extracurriculars at the school, the male protagonist will have the option to choose between a few different sports clubs. The male protagonist can choose to partake in swimming, kendo, or running as his after-school athletic activity. And later in the year, you'll also be able to join the music, art, or photography clubs as well. With the release of Persona 3 Portable in 2009, Atlus added a female option for your main character. The bulk of the changes come in your dialogue responses throughout the game. The male protagonist is much more somber, while the female protagonist comes across as much more upbeat. While the major story beats are the same no matter which character you choose, the dialogue you experience will be affected by the choice. And the tone shift might be an important detail for some people, considering the dark nature of Persona 3's story. You'll also notice your character talks a lot more to the female members of your squad, instead of being closer to male characters, like your normal character tends to be in Persona. While the majority of your academic progress will be between the same protagonists, the two have different extracurricular options. The female protagonist is able to join one of two sports clubs, either the volleyball club or the tennis club. The social link for the athletic club for the female is filled by Ryo Iwazaki instead of Kazuchi Miyamoto in the male MC route. Unlike the male protagonist though, the female protagonist does not have the option to join a culture club. The fortune social link the male protagonist meets at his culture club is instead filled by Ryoji for the female MC. Speaking of your social links, the female protagonist's social links are vastly different. Now you can begin social links with the male members of your squad, something the male protagonist couldn't. In tandem, the female social links have been tweaked in the female route as well, as the female protagonist cannot date the female social links. However, you'll find them friendlier to the female protagonist in general. Additionally, as the female protagonist, you'll be able to date one of the male characters. And while the male protagonist was made to date everyone who was interested, the female protagonist can reject romantic advances if you're not interested in dating that character. When it comes to the dungeon crawling aspect of Persona 3, not only have the battle sprites been updated, but you'll be going through Tartarus using different weapons than the male main character. While the male protagonist uses a one-handed sword, the female protagonist instead uses a naginata, a sword with an exceptionally long pole used originally by samurai. And I'd also like to apologise if I mispronounced that. Anyway, it wouldn't be a Persona game without personas to summon. And with the female protagonist route, you've got the choice between two Velvet Room attendants. While the male protagonist defaults to Elizabeth, The female protagonist can choose between Elizabeth or Theodore. They both serve the same role, so the choice is ultimately up to preference. There are a handful of other changes in the female protagonist route. One of these is that the UI changes to pink when you're using the female protagonist, instead of the default blue for the male protagonist. The game's sound director, Shoji Meguro, came up with 10 new songs for the game's re-release, and you'll find most of them in the female protagonist soundtrack. And finally, there are a few scenes that change if you've chosen the female protagonist. The core of the story remains the same, but there are small tweaks made to the female protagonist route to accommodate her different social links and dialogue options. Ultimately, there's no right or wrong answer for which gender protagonist you should choose for your first playthrough. If you're looking for the most standard playthrough of Persona 3 as the story was originally intended to be told, then the male protagonist may be the right choice for you. He's recommended for newcomers to Persona 3, or those looking for a thematically darker playthrough, as his is the original version of the game. While the male protagonist is featured heavily in the original versions of the game, the female protagonist is recommended for people who have already played Persona 3 and are looking to experience it a little differently than their previous playthrough. Additionally, the female protagonist is the better choice if you're looking for different social links, as she has new social links for the male squad members, and fans tend to think she has the best social links, so if this is important to you, it might be a big factor in your decision. So there's a guide on whether you should choose the male or female protagonist in Persona 3 Portable. Thanks for watching, and check out thegamer.com for more.